Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar about the Responsible Steel Standard. We will talk about fundamentals, benefits, and the certification process. Before I dig into the topic, I want to introduce you to GUTcert and who we are, what we do. We are a certification company located in Berlin, Germany. However, we belong to an international group which is called the AFNOR Group, and colleagues of mine of France conducted the first ever certification audit of Responsible Steel last week in Belgium. And as I heard, that was a success and everything went good. So we are quite happy about that. Just to have a look to our portfolio, we certify basically the main management systems such as ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and so on. But we have strong roots into sustainability related certification schemes, and that's why we added the Responsible Steel Standard into our portfolio for the coming years. The speakers of today, I'm happy to welcome Mani Bammert here. Mani is the technical director of Responsible Steel, and she played a huge role in developing the standard, so she can report firsthand from the standard development and background information. And on the right-hand side, it's me, Michael. I'm a product manager at GUTcert in Berlin. The agenda for today will be that Mani will introduce you to Responsible Steel and give you some background information. After that, I will go into detail through the certification process of Responsible Steel. And as I'm sure that many of you are familiar with management systems such as ISO 14001, I will highlight some similarities, but also differences between these different schemes and go into detail there. With this, I'll give the floor to Mani. Mani, it's your turn.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction, Michael. My name is Mani Bammert. I'm the Technical Director of Responsible Steel and will give you some background information on our program. Increasingly, we see that clients, stakeholders, and society ask businesses to take responsibility for their social and environmental impacts. We see this especially from the automotive sector, the construction sector, and also from finance. And we call this part of the social license to operate from companies. And we see this also reflected in an increasing civil society movement that asks companies to take action against climate change, the decline in biodiversity, and also against increasing social injustices. And Responsible Steel provides steel companies and their customers with a strategic response to this. The demand for responsible steel has also been reflected in a number of recent studies, and I just would like to highlight two of them here. One was published in November 2018 by the Energy Transitions Commission, and the report shows that reaching net zero carbon emissions for heavy industry and also heavy-duty transport can be done through ambitious policy, but also accelerated innovation and investment, and it can be done by 2060. So this sends a very strong signal to the steel sector and others to become active and counter the impacts of climate change. The other report I would like to highlight was published by the bank HSBC in 2019, and it pretty much repeats the message of the ETC. The report called Steel for the Future points out that an energy transition by the sector is technically feasible, but that demand from buyers is needed for low carbon steel to step up the acceleration process. We have also seen two important announcements recently. One came from ArcelorMittal, the world's biggest steel company. They have committed to having all of their flat steel product sites in Europe assessed against the Responsible Steel Standard this year. So hopefully this will set off a sort of avalanche of participants in the Responsible Steel program. And we have also seen Anglo-American big mining company joining ResponsibleSteel as part of their commitment to support sustainability efforts by their customers. They are committed to having all of their mine sites assessed against a credible mining standard. And as part of that commitment, they also became a member of ResponsibleSteel to support the transition of their clients to a more sustainable way of operating. Steel is a very important sector. It has quite a big footprint, which is shown on this slide. 93 or actually 95% of all metal that is produced annually is used by the steel sector. With regards to some other mined materials, 20% of tin and tungsten globally are used by the steel sector, 60% of nickel and zinc, 75% of chromium, 85% of manganese and vanadium. The steel sector also uses 10% of the world's coal production, and it emits between 7 and 9% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally. So it is a really important sector, and its importance cannot be underestimated, really. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay in moving the slides. That's why I take quite long breaks in between. What is ResponsibleSteel trying to achieve? Our vision is to contribute to a sustainable society by maximizing steel's contribution to that. And we want to do this by enhancing the responsible sourcing, production, use, and recycling of steel. And our mission encompasses 3 elements. One is providing a multi-stakeholder forum to build trust and achieve consensus. And we're on a good path to achieving that through over the last 3 years actually. We've developed the ResponsibleSteel Standard with many of the relevant stakeholders of the steel supply chain. So we have built this forum already where people come together from different angles of the steel sector to discuss the sector's pertinent issues and to come to agreement on that. We have also developed a standard, which was published in November 2019, so just a little while ago, and a certification program that is now taking off. And we will also develop related tools to that to help companies achieve ResponsibleSteel certification. We will drive positive change through the recognition and use of responsible steel. We will do this mainly through claims and logos that can be used and communications from our end. And we recognize we're a young and a relatively small organization, so we cannot achieve our mission all at once. We will focus first on the responsible sourcing and production of steel. The Responsible Steel program encompasses different elements. One is the standard that I've already mentioned. It sets a benchmark for steel companies with regards to their environmental and social performance, and the benchmark that needs to be achieved to be able to call themselves a responsibly operating site. It also encompasses assurance and oversight. That means rules for auditors to engage in responsible steel assessments, rules for the auditors to engage external stakeholders in the assessment, and also rules on transparency with relation to audit results. We will also develop an impacts program. That means we want to measure what the impact of the Responsible Steel program is. How do practices on the ground really change? What are we contributing to a more responsible world? And finally, we want to create, of course, business value through our certification program. And that business value translates into different aspects. For one, through the multi-stakeholder consultation process that we have started, we have collectively identified what the main issues are for the steel sector from an environmental and social point of view. So the Responsible Steel Standard helps companies mitigate their risk in that area. We have also, as I said earlier, we are creating a logo and claims that can be used by certified companies and by companies that are members of Responsible Steel. So through participation in the Responsible Steel program, we anticipate that we will create added value for brands, and that will hopefully materialize once the first certifications come through. Our standard development process with engagement from civil society has ensured that civil society actually supports our standard and thinks that it is a reasonable benchmark for steel companies to call themselves responsible. So it will also help with improving relations with civil society. In the public procurement sector and also from downstream customers, as well as from the finance sector, we see that they increasingly take account of environmental and social aspects when they produce their specifications, and the Responsible Steel Standard is a suitable tool to meet these demands. In the legal compliance area, we anticipate that environmental and social compliance or regulation requirements will increase in the future rather than be weakened. The Responsible Steel Standard in some aspects goes beyond legal compliance, so we think that this is a good tool for working towards future compliance issues for the steel sector. In the same area, policy preparedness means the steel sector needs a suitable policy framework, a suitable policy environment to make the transition to low carbon steel, the transition that we need to see in this world. And again, the Responsible Steel Standard is a suitable tool for achieving that. On this, on this slide, you can see our current members. We have around about 60 members by now. They are divided into business, civil society, and then associate members. We have seen a strong increase in membership in recent months, and we're set to see continued strong growth throughout this year. And we want to make a particular push for recruiting more civil society members to have better balance between business and civil society. And in the associate category, you see companies like GUTcert and other certification bodies. You see research institutes, associations, consultants, etc., that are also part of the Responsible Steel member. What does the standard contain? It is built around 12 principles that you can see on this slide. The corporate leadership and the management systems principle are basically the foundation for everything else in the standard. The standard is, of course, about occupational health and safety, which is the top priority for the steel sector. It includes labor rights, human rights, stakeholder engagement, communities, climate change, noise emissions, effluents and waste, water stewardship, biodiversity, and finally decommissioning and closure. And as I mentioned earlier, through a multi-stakeholder process over the last 3 years, we have developed a consensus on what makes a responsible steel company, and this consensus is reflected in the standard. So underneath these 12 principles, you can find about 50 criteria, which are then further broken down into around about 200 requirements. And it is these requirements that audits against the Responsible Steel Standard are looking into, and they are the requirements that companies need to meet to become certified. Now, this is where the Responsible Steel story becomes a bit more complex. On the right-hand side, you can see Responsible Steel Site Certification. This is what we're offering since November 2019. So steel sites can become certified to our current standard. And that means that they can claim that their site operates responsibly. So everything happening on that site is deemed to be done in a responsible manner. What we want to work on this year are additional requirements in relation to the sourcing of raw materials and also in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. And only if these additional requirements are also met by a site, then is it in a position to make claims about the steel products that it produces on that site. And that is related to the claims and logo work that I mentioned earlier. So we will have different kinds of logos and claims that certified companies can use, depending on whether they meet the site certification requirements only, or also the additional product-related requirements that we will develop throughout this year. But what we are doing with regards to raw material sourcing is we do not have in mind to create yet another standard for mining operations, but we intend to work with existing mine certification schemes like the ones you can see on this slide. And we want to develop a mechanism through which we can decide whether these certification programs are equally robust or even robuster than the Responsible Steel program, and whether the assurance program that they are running can be deemed to be credible. And if that is the case, then we will accept mine sites that are certified to these programs as contributing to the site performance of a steelmaking company. And we currently have a program with IRMA, so the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, and also with Towards Sustainable Mining by the Mining Association of Canada to progress on this work stream. But we're also planning to look into other programs like Better Coal, like the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, and also the International Council on Mining and Metals. And with that, I would like to hand over to Michael to take you through the assurance program and the steps that a responsible steel audit will entail.
Thank you very much, Mani, for this nice introduction and background information on responsible steel. Please feel free to write any questions you might have into our comment section. Mani will be here until after the webinar, so she's there to answer your questions firsthand. As I said, I will now for the next, say, 20 minutes go into detail through the certification process of a company. To begin with, I want to start with an overview of the different steps that have to be taken by the site which wants to be certificated or certified. First step would be that the site or the company becomes a member of Responsible Steel, because only members of Responsible Steel can go through the certification process and can become certified. Once this is done, the site will conduct a self-assessment, relevant stakeholders have to be identified, and there will be a media analysis by the site. In a second step, there will be the audit preparation for us, the certification body, and for the auditors, which is basically getting all the information from the site and reviewing it if everything is okay, or if we can add more stakeholders to the list or more media publications that we have found. So we will check whether all the information that comes from the site are good or whether there is something missing. After that, there will, like in any other management scheme, a site visit from the auditors. So the auditors will come to your site, conduct worker and also stakeholder interviews. After the audit, there will be an audit report, of course, which can be rechecked by the site. And if the site says there are no errors in the report, we will hand over the report to Responsible Steel, to the assurance panel, and waiting for feedback, because only if we get a green light from the assurance panel, we can go on with our certification decision. And if there are no major non-conformities we can see against the standard, then we will, of course, issue the certificate. And the last step will be the publication of a summary of the report on the Responsible Steel homepage. With the next few slides, I will point out some similarities and differences of the Responsible Steel certification process with the classical management systems such as ISO 14001 or ISO 45001. The first similarity I could find is that you have to conduct a self-assessment, which is nothing other than conducting an internal audit, which is a normal way in the preparation for a certification audit. However, the nature of the self-assessment is determined by Responsible Steel, and therefore Responsible Steel developed a comprehensive Excel file, which is called the Responsible Steel Implementation Instructions. On this slide, you can see an extract from this implementation instructions. This is an example for principle number 2, social, environmental, and governance management systems. You can see that all the principles, all the criteria, and all the requirements are listed on the left side. And what the site has to do is to self-assess whether it fulfills this criteria or not, and information will be given in the green fields on the right side of this slide. If the site thinks that, yes, we fulfill this criteria, then there has to be supporting evidence. So we need documents or some kind of evidence that reflect the fulfillment of the criteria, and this will be rechecked by the auditors and by us, the certification body, after that. Another similarity is with all management systems that go with the new high-level structure, like the ISO 14001, but also ISO 45001 and so on. There will be the requirement to identify relevant stakeholders. This is also be done, for example, in chapter 4.1, 4.2 in ISO 14001, where you have to conduct a context analysis. And this includes, obviously, the indication of relevant stakeholders. So there is no difference in that point at the first glance. Again, here an extract from the implementation instructions Excel sheet. You can find on the left side different categories of possible stakeholders. This could be local communities, government authorities, and so on. And you will have to give further information on these stakeholders in this list. Let's come to the differences between ResponsibleSteel and management systems. First of all, the term media analysis is something you haven't heard of probably in relation to classical management systems. But the idea is to check whether there have been issues related to ResponsibleSteel, whether there were any publications that indicate some non-conformities, for example. And the ResponsibleSteel Standard requires companies to provide a list of articles for at least the last 18 months. How this might look like, you can see here again an extract from the ResponsibleSteel implementation instructions tool. There is a list of different publications. The type of publication you can see on the right-hand side. It could be local or regional media, but it could also include scientific studies, scientific media, or online information. The second difference is, I said before, or I mentioned, that you have to identify your stakeholders just as in other management schemes as well. That's right. But ResponsibleSteel goes a step further in this point, and it requires the certification body and also the site and the auditor to actively approach these stakeholders and give them the possibility to participate in the audit also. And as I mentioned in the overview of the different steps, there will be also interviews conducted with some stakeholder groups during the stage 2 audit. A last point I want to mention is the publication of the summary or of the certification decision, because this is something in ISO schemes you won't have this kind of publication. But I want to stress here that, of course, no sensitive data will be published. It will be only a summary of the report and only information that can go public. And it will be published on the ResponsibleSteel homepage. The certification cycle might seem familiar at the first glance. However, there will be in between the initial certification audit and the recertification audit, there will be only one surveillance audit, and this will happen around 18 months after the initial audit. So we have a total certification cycle of 3 years, like in other schemes, but only one surveillance audit. A major difference, however, is that there will be ongoing monitoring activities of the certified site by the certification body or the auditors. And if there are any issues come up that indicate that there might be major non-conformities with the standard, then we will have the possibility to carry out a special audit and to go to check these specific aspects, whether there is a non-conformity or whether we can keep the certificate uphold. This slide shows the specific relation between responsible steel, between the principles of responsible steel and environmental and health and safety management systems, so ISO 14001 and ISO 45001. For principle 3, it is easy to say that many aspects are covered in ISO 45001. Even the name is pretty much the same, occupational health and safety. This is what ISO 45001 covers basically. However, this is not the case for all principles that tackle environmental aspects, like principle 8, 9, 10, and 11. There, the Responsible Steel Standard has specific criteria, specific requirements that have to be evaluated and assessed by the site, by the auditor, and have to be fulfilled at the end to become certified. On the other side, on the right-hand side, I copied a term or a sentence from ISO 14001, where it says, within the defined scope of the environmental management system, the organization shall determine the environmental aspects of its activities, products and services, and so on. So there is somehow room for interpretation. The organization has the possibility to say we have this aspect, but probably water stewardship is not an issue for us, so we will not tackle this. And this cannot happen in the Responsible Steel Standard. You have to tackle these issues, the requirements that are listed in the standard. I want to use the next 5 to 10 minutes of this webinar to illustrate the Responsible Steel certification process for 2 different companies, or for 2 different sites, better said. The first site would be Big Steel, as I named it. Big Steel is a site with 2,000 workers, and there is a primary steel production going on. In the light of responsible steel, we will have a high risk. On the other side, we will have a small steel company which fabricates steel products, for example, steel tubes. We have around 200 workers at the site, and in relation to responsible steel, there will be a low risk. How do you assess this risk? Either it's high or low or medium. There are 6 aspects that have to be considered. They are listed on the bottom half of the slide. As you see, there are environmental health and safety aspects. We will check whether existing management systems exist. So if you do have an ISO 45001, for example, already implemented in your site, this could lower your overall risk assessment. Then we will check whether there have been issues of legal compliance. The context aspect is evaluated on a country level. We will therefore analyze the Corruption Perception Index, the Environmental Performance Index, and the Human Freeman Index. And the last point would be if there have been any stakeholder concerns. So we will check all these 6 points, and they will end up to a risk assessment. A very important point for all companies, sites that want to be certified is the audit time. So I illustrated here the audit time calculation for you, but this is straightforward. We have two determinants for the calculation of the audit time. This will be one, the number of workers at the site, And the second is the risk assessment, and these two terms together will end up to one specific audit time. I have to say the table which is illustrated here gives the total number of audit days for an initial audit. Total number of audit days here means that will include preparation works, that will include stage 1, stage 2, and post-audit activities. So all of it will be covered in those days. For the surveillance audit, we will account for around 1/3 of the time that is used in the initial audit. And in the recertification process, it will be around 2/3 of the time given here in the table. How does that look like for our two companies? Just to remember, we have the big steel site with 2,000 workers and a high risk. The number of audit days is highlighted in the purple color. So we will end up with a total number of days with 21. As I mentioned before, around 50% of the total time will be spent for stage 2 audit on site. So this will be 10.5 days on site with the auditor or the auditors. If there are more than one auditor, obviously we can reduce the number, the days spent, the actual days spent on the site. If there are 2 auditors, for example, we will come for 5 days, around 5 days to your site and analyze the whole certification scheme. For the small steel site, we will end up, this is the blue color here, we will end up with a total number of 7 days. And again, only half of that will be spent for stage 2 on site, so around 3.5 days. I explained the self-assessment part with some extracts of the Responsible Steel Implementation Instruction Excel sheet before, so I don't want to go into detail here, but the sites have to identify stakeholders, give us a list with articles and other publications so we can review all this information, and there will be the self-assessment of this Principle 1 to 12. And also we need some supporting evidence if you think that your site fulfills the criteria, so we can recheck this evidence. For stage 1 audit, the auditor will basically, or we as a certification body also will review all the information given by the site in the self-assessment, and we will also review the existing certifications in the site. What is important that the scope of your management systems, if you want to include them somehow in the audit time calculation, for example, the scope needs to be the same than for the Responsible Steel certification. Then if we see that there are some articles or some stakeholders missing in the list, we will add the information, and the outcome of stage 1 then will be that the auditor says the site is ready for stage 2 or not. If the site is ready and we can go on with the audit planning for stage 2, we will then, around 4 weeks before the audit, reach out to all the identified stakeholders and give them the possibility to connect to us or to take contact with us and to participate in the audit process. Stage 2 includes, as mentioned before, worker and also stakeholder interviews, but also an on-site observation of processes and activities that go on the site. And of course, the auditor has to classify at the end if there is a conformity or if there are some issues that indicate non-conformities, and will then lead to the certification decision in the end. For the worker interviews, there's also a clear definition of how many interviews have to be conducted or how many workers have to be interviewed. The table is gives you an idea on the left. Again, for our two sites, we have the big steel company in purple. Around we have 2,000 workers, and the total number of workers interviewed here will be 35. And this will be divided into individual interviews and also group interviews. So there is a clear definition of how these interviews have to be conducted, given by ResponsibleSteel and the table here on the left. For the small steel company side, we will have in total 15 workers that will be interviewed. 6 of them will be interviewed individually, and we have 3 groups of 3 people which will be interviewed via group interviews. The final step of the certification process are the preparation of the audit report, of course. And if we get the green light from the assurance panel, then we will go on with our certification decision. Like in any other management scheme, there will be no certificates issued if there are major nonconformities. So those major nonconformities have to be closed before we can issue at the end the certificate. And the final step will then be that we send all our documents to ResponsibleSteel, and there will be the publication of the report summary and the certification decision on the ResponsibleSteel homepage. This was all we had to say about ResponsibleSteel, the certification process. This is the last slide of our webinar today, and I want to invite you to contact us if you have any questions after the webinar. If you have any specific questions, I will, of course, get in touch with Mani if there are some questions related to the standard specifically that I cannot answer. But you are welcome to also subscribe to the ResponsibleSteel and GUTcert newsletter, where we will keep you updated of current developments of ResponsibleSteel. And of course, you will find further information on our homepage. With this, I would say we are free for the questions, for your questions. And therefore, I will check our comment sections. I see that there was one question in regards to the integration of ResponsibleSteel audits to other certification schemes. Just to briefly, from my side, answer to that question is that the possibility, of course, is there, and we know that companies always want to include audits and not conduct an extra audit. This is a huge effort for companies. We are sure of that. And we, for example, here at GUTcert, we have auditors that can audit ISO 14001, ISO 45001, and also are qualified to audit the ResponsibleSteel Standard. So there are overlaps where the same person can audit all the systems. But maybe to hand over the question to Mani, you can give some further background information on the integration of other schemes.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, I agree. It might be possible to conduct ResponsibleSteel audits and ISO 14001 or 45001 audits at the same time. We have very deliberately looked to ISO 45001 when developing the health and safety principle. So there is strong overlap. However, the ResponsibleSteel program always includes, as Michael pointed out, a component of including stakeholders in the audit. So there will still have to be carried out interviews with external stakeholders in relation to health and safety, and also worker interviews, as Michael mentioned. In relation to ISO 14001, that standard is more generic, and Michael already pointed out that there is quite some room for interpretation for companies to identify what the crucial environmental issues are for their business. And Responsible Steel is much more specific for that, since it has been specifically written for the steel sector. So while it will help with audit preparations, it might not be so that an ISO 14001 certification ticks off all the environmental aspects in the Responsible Steel program.
Thank you, Mani, for this answer. I found another question in regards to what happens when I have multiple sites, and we know it from other certification schemes that there is the possibility to conduct multi-site certifications. And this obviously is a question, maybe again to Mani. Is it possible to have this multi-site kind of certification?
Thank you, Michael, for the question. Generally, multi-site audits are possible. What we still have to see, though, is there cannot be sampling of sites. So each and every site that is part of that multi-group has to have its own site visit. The sites will have different types of stakeholders. Some might be managed at corporate level, but other stakeholders will be managed at site level. So these stakeholders need to have the opportunity to provide input to the audits. And I guess a big question is on whether all of the sites are managed under the same management system. If they are not, then multi-site certification will not result in reduction of audit time. If the company is highly integrated and all the sites are covered by the same management system, then audit time might be able to be reduced.
All right, thank you, Mani. For the moment, I see no further questions. So I would say that we can round up the webinar. I thank you all for participating. And again, if you have any questions, there's a last question coming now in. Could you specify the implementation of the stakeholder within this certification process? How can the stakeholders influence the certification process if they are contacted before the audit? This is a good question. I will hand it over to Mani again.
I think I'm unmuted, I hope. Okay, great. As Michael mentioned already, the stakeholders of a steel site have to be identified before the audit. And at least 4 weeks before the audit, they must be contacted and given the opportunity to provide input to the audit. Now, that means that they can either submit written documents, studies, for example, that have been released on the site, or they can agree to be interviewed by the Responsible Steel auditors during the stage 2 audit. The stakeholders are a very rich source of information. So aside from the site itself, that of course has the main body of information, they can provide additional input that helps get a comprehensive view of the site, that helps the auditors create a balanced opinion of the site. And we feel that companies should not be afraid to have stakeholders provide input to the audit, because as I mentioned earlier, this is also about the social license to operate. And actually, sites are quite interested in hearing what their stakeholders think, and a lot of sites already have active stakeholder engagement. But yeah, as I said, the key here is to give all relevant stakeholders the opportunity to provide input, and then it's the job of the auditor to cross-check information, to triangulate information, and then to come a view on what is the truth, so to say, about the site. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you again. I think the question was from Malik. Perfect, and it answered his question he just wrote. Perfect. Thank you all of you for participating. And again, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate, contact us. We are happy to answer all questions. Then have a nice day and talk to you soon. Bye.